How can your organization be effective, innovative, and productive? What strategy can you use to turn your reactive organization into an inactive one? Most people are familiar with whether they're being reactive or proactive, but for other individuals, staying inactive seems strange in some ways. The reason is that we don't spend much time consciously in an inactive mode. 95% of our time is spent reacting to what the world does to us. To innovate, you must move your entire life system to a whole new level. In this episode of the Dominate Your Market podcast, we have invited Alex Nesbitt, who has over 30 years of experience helping senior executives develop strategies, build new businesses, and manage transformative change. He will talk about the 3-step model for development, how solving a narrow problem repetitively can make more people come to you for help, and turning your organization from reactive to inactive. Tune in and learn more.
Welcome to the Dominate Your Market podcast, where we interview leaders, CEOs, founders, and high-impact business development professionals to get their insights on how you can grow your business efficiently, build an amazing company, and still have a life. Today's guest is Alex Nesbitt. Alex has over 30 years of experience helping senior executives develop strategy, build new businesses, and manage transformative change. He is a former partner and managing director of the Boston Consulting Group, where he led client service teams for over 15 years. I'd also like to say he's a pretty good guy. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. Nice to be here.
How are you doing today?
I'm excited about it. It's always fun to talk about. This is like one of my favorite subjects. So being able to find a way to communicate it to more people is always exciting.
Yeah, your background is actually quite impressive. And what I want you to do is tell our listeners kind of where you came from and how you got to where you're at now.
Sure. So going way back, and I originally thought I was going to be, I didn't know anything about anything. I came from a small town here in Southern California, and my parents were both in the healthcare arena, and all I knew is that they were kind of doctors and lawyers, and so originally I thought I was going to be a lawyer and working on intellectual property stuff, but finally figured out what lawyers actually did and realized that was a stupid idea. Kind of discovered business and became a kind of my love over time, and the thing that was most interesting to me is kind of how we develop businesses. How do we grow and develop and make them work well? And I think that's kind of been a perennial challenge. But I originally got introduced to a company called the Boston Consulting Group, and it was great. I got to work on some of the biggest problems and help influence decisions on some of the biggest scales in the world. Most of the work was for very large companies, 15 billion, whatever, $10 billion companies. And originally we did what was called, I would describe it, give consulting a bad name. It was kind of the idea of like seagull consulting, which is kind of you drop in and you deliver some wisdom and then you leave. Kind of realized that over time that just isn't the most effective way to work. That there's a much more powerful model, which is around self-discovery and how do you get people to figure things out for themselves, if you will. And it's a much more powerful model. And we kind of changed the practice around at the firm to try and make that happen in more clients. That was really a great experience. I'd always wanted to do something entrepreneurial, so I decided after 15 years to and it was the internet was kind of taking off, and a client, actually a former client, approached me about starting a new business. He was interested in doing something in the sort of telephone service arena, and we ended up actually switching to fulfillment, internet fulfillment, regional e-commerce fulfillment. How do you deliver packages to people? And we knew a lot about that, and it was a real problem at the time. So we started a fulfillment company, which morphed into, thanks to a bunch of venture funding, into a same-day delivery company. So we were delivering, this is a couple of decades ago, we were doing same-day delivery a couple of decades ago. You order by 2, we delivered by 8. And we had that running in 8 metros around the country. And we were a third-party fulfillment, so we didn't, it wasn't our own product, it was client's product. And then the consumer internet kind of collapsed, right? And the funding for it collapsed. So all our clients started going bankrupt, and then we sort of switched over into time critical spare parts. So we were shipping things like aircraft parts or MRI parts or whatever, anything that needed same day delivery. We were doing that, and then eventually sold those operations off to Ryder Logistics. But it was a great formative experience because we not only had the physical side of the business we were building out, we also built a lot of software. And I learned a lot about what I didn't know about software. But it was really interesting because we built what was probably before its time, a SaaS, piece of SaaS software. It was API driven. It was a pretty interesting piece of multi-location fulfillment software. So that kind of led me to do more work about trying to understand technology and how its role inside companies. I went back to doing independent consulting, and this time probably working more with smaller companies, more in the $40 million to $1 billion kind of range. I would say something where I could have more impact because it's less at 15 billion, things work through politics. Right, that's how they work. I mean, that is the nature of those kinds of organizations. When you get down to smaller organizations, individuals can have much more impact. Things can be much more direct, which is really interesting and helpful. And with one of those clients, I spent 4 or 5 years actually mentoring him. He asked me a question along the way, which is he described it as, I want to have an advantage like IKEA, just like this, this iconic, competitive advantage. How do I get that? And I kind of gave him my spiel, which is, it's a coherent business operation, a business model, which it's how it works, and which is kind of unsatisfying because it was like that's kind of what the end was, right? I mean, that's what it is now. Right? Well, where did this thing come from? Right? What are the origin stories of great competitive advantage? And that led me into studying advantage pretty in depth and in multiple that led me to looking at Walmart, Southwest Airlines, IKEA, Google, and Amazon, all these companies that you think of as having real competitive advantage. Where did this come from, right? And if you look at these companies, what you see is kind of a couple of things, one of which is almost always there is some imposed constraint upon them. Something happens to them or they do something to themselves that imposes this constraint. And then they have to overcome this constraint. And it's in this overcoming of this constraint that it's sort of is where the innovation comes that kind of leads them to competitive advantage. So Walmart, for example, right, they had Sam Walton started his stores in small towns, not because he thought it was a great idea, but because his wife said she would only marry him if he lived in a small town. So, and then it's because he was in small towns, right? His suppliers wouldn't deliver directly to his stores. They just refused to do it. They would do that for Kmart, but they wouldn't do it for him. So he ended up having to build his own distribution system because they wouldn't let him do that. Southwest, right? They almost were driven out of business by other companies, and they ended up having to reduce their fleet, sell one of their planes to keep themselves afloat. So they went from 4 planes to 3 planes, but to keep their schedule up, they had to radically shorten the turnaround times, and that led to the fast gate turnarounds. That the overcoming that constraint led to this. And I could tell you the same sort of story about IKEA or Walmart or Amazon. Any of these companies, they have some sort of a constraint, and the ones where like Amazon and Google are really interesting in the sense that they've essentially imposed a constraint of automation, right? Which is it has to be done. The machine has to do it, right? I mean, and therefore it's going to be less good than what a human curated version of the same thing would be, but it'll be scalable, So you see this kind of imposition. So there's this whole thing about constraints led me to a lot of work on constraints and trying to understand how do you use them, why are they important. Took me into all kinds of, and you see it's the same sort of phenomena happening in thermodynamics. You see it happening in arts. You see it happening in architecture. You see it happening in life. I mean, that energy is basically flowing through the universe, right? And it's being shaped. Its flow is being shaped by constraints, right? And the constraints can help us both amplify our effect and diminish our effect. So started to understand that there was something about constraints which makes a big difference. And that led me to sort of try and encapsulate what that idea was. And that led me to this notion that originally comes from neuroscience called enaction, with an action, which is not a word most people are familiar with, right? Most people are familiar with the word being reactive or being proactive, but being inactive is kind of a bit foreign for people. But that's because we don't spend a lot of conscious time in an inactive mode. I mean, we are mostly reactive beings. We spend probably 95% of our time reacting to what the world is doing to us. But inaction is the idea, and even when we're reactive, we are enacting our world. We just don't realize it. Inaction is the idea that we co-create our world, and our world co-creates us. It's a non-dual version of reality, which says, we are responsible for who we are. We're responsible for who we're not. And what's really interesting to me, which is that it says, whatever mess we are in, whatever situation we are in, we have co-created it. And if we co-created it, we can uncreate it. And it kind of gave me this insight into, if I tried to encapsulate or compress all of my thoughts into one word, it was this inaction word, which is, and it isn't 100% of everything, but it's kind of the 20% that makes 80% work. And it's this notion that we can manage ourselves in a way to go from being reactive to the world and sort of just letting the world happen to us, to being consciously inactive. We can choose to have intention. We can choose to have, know what we want to get done. Now, the question is, what's the mechanism to make that work, right? Because if we can make that work more systematically, we can dramatically improve our lives. I would say that, one client, we went from 40 million to 400 million. But it's all sort of using this, sort of circular process of saying, what is the objective? What behaviors are required to make that objective happen? And then what conditions, right, support those behaviors to emerge spontaneously? Because normally what we do is we say, my goal is X. I need these behaviors, these actions to happen to reach X. And then we kind of force it to happen, right? We try and make people do that somehow. But it's not spontaneous. It's not sort of just what people do. It's not how they, normally react. It's kind of a bit abnormal for them. And then they revert to the old behaviors, and everything kind of falls apart. But what's different about inaction is the idea that we need to look at the conditions that support the behaviors, that kind of that stimulate the behaviors or hold them back. Right. One of the canonical examples is so a hotel chain, right? You have a hotel, and the constraint on a hotel making money is renting out the rooms, right? If you get all your rooms rented out all the time, you're going to maximize how much money you make. But what we we're fine. So you want your receptionist is the person that's most important in the hotel, because they're the ones who say, yeah, we have a room available. Yeah, you want it? I'll give it to you. Well, this hotel was having struggle, so they realized that they needed to incent these receptionists to rent out all the rooms. But so they created all this incentive plan for these receptionists to do that, and then but the receptionists weren't renting out the rooms. Why weren't they renting out the rooms? As they dug into it deeper, what you see was, well, not all the rooms were actually ready. I mean, they weren't ready on time, right? Because of the maid service, or they weren't quite properly maintained. So there's the TV didn't work or something. So you ended up sort of from the receptionist perspective, giving out all of my rooms is really risky, right? Because
unhappy
I'm going to get
customers.
yelled at. I'm going to get yelled at, right? And that's the negative feedback was much more, avoiding the negative feedback was much more important to them than getting the incentive, So to cure that, we had to sort of change the conditions which made them feel secure that they could give out a room without consequence of getting yelled at, right? Which meant getting people to properly maintain rooms and clean rooms and make sure the underlying support processes created a condition where the behavior would be naturally, yes, I have a room, And so it's operating at this third level of changing conditions that is in some ways the most powerful because it's enduring. And if you go into other sciences, you kind of see why it's enduring, which is just second law of thermodynamics is that energy spreads, it dissipates, it kind of, flattens out. It's like water wants to become flat and spread out, right? It becomes and so everything and in human behavior, what you would refer to as like we revert to the norm, we revert to the mean, right? Things like that were extraordinary become ordinary, right? Things that were terrible become ordinary. Everything kind of reverts to the mean. So the mean is the condition, right? That's where we live, and so if you want to shift behavior, you have to raise the mean. You have to raise the bar, and you have to live in that higher level and maintaining that non-normal, and that is a non-normal state, right? Because if it was normal, everybody would be doing it, right? And that is the fundamental challenge of running a business. You're in a non-normal state, right? And you're maintaining that. And that's why it takes a lot of work and effort and ongoing care and maintenance of the company, not just kind of cashing out all the time. So I kind of got on a lot there. Maybe I should give you a chance to interject, ask some questions.
Well, what's interesting with all that, thank you for that, by the way. But so I'm a very layman guy, right? So when I talk to CEOs, I talk very layman. I don't want to get scientific and all of that.
Sure.
So when you say constraints and you talk about these issues, in my mind, the word bottleneck comes up.
Yeah.
And so even on my LinkedIn, I say, I fix your bottlenecks, right on my LinkedIn. Yeah. So that's the same sort of idea, I think, is what you're saying is going in and find out what the issues are that's causing them to not achieve a certain result, is one way to look at that, right? And I think another would be if you're setting the goals, the new goals, then what does need to take place, and that could be fixing an existing bottleneck, or that could be anticipating something as well.
Yep.
But I think with what you said, it's really interesting because, well, number one, I want to go way back really quick. When you start talking about your background, because I want to just go back to that. So you were doing, because I find this fascinating, and we'll talk about it for a split second. So you were doing same day delivery decades ago.
Yeah.
So I want the listeners to hear that because, how long has Amazon been doing same day? And Amazon even today still doesn't do full blown same day delivery, but because I'll never forget when I think you could get it in 2 days. I think that might have been the big shift for me with Amazon was 2 days. Oh my God.
I think most of Amazon is probably next day, right?
Yeah.
And it's not, the logistics of next day are actually that was where we originally started, was next day for the price of ground. Because if you look at the country, with 8 facilities or so, you can probably cover 80% of the population with 8 facilities. Yeah, and get things delivered next day ground, right? And the trick is having enough velocity in your inventory to make it easy to be able to distribute the inventory across 8 locations. Yeah, and that's, if you look at Amazon, it's like all about how many locations do they have, and how much velocity is there in the product? How quickly is that product turning and selling? And if you look at where they'll have same day delivery, it'll be the stuff that's the fastest moving, highest velocity products. That they can stock everywhere, so they're basically just throwing another product on the truck, which, so they're kind of taking advantage of the window of opportunity that is presented by the normal distribution. Ours was a bit more, we were designing for same day, so it was a bit more challenging.
No, just the thought of that was decades ago just blows my mind, right? Because that's the phrase ahead of your time, right? That's literally a situation.
That was way ahead of our time. Yeah, we were outpacing our custom. We were actually outpacing the demand for same day delivery, right, in the consumer space. They just weren't ready for it in most cases.
Which I think is amazing because that even dovetails into customer service, customer experience, right? All of that, which is a big part of a successful company, right? Is that customer experience and what did they feel through all the different touch points, and was it a good feeling all the way through to the very end? And then even after the end, quote, the end, it still continues on with better service and all of that. So and I really, that's a big thing for me, right? I love that stuff.
Yeah, and that's what we kind of actually, a lot of the thinking came from, did a lot of work on in the auto industry, looking at customer satisfaction, breaking down all the drivers of customer satisfaction. And you find that best experience is like you never have a problem. right? Everything just goes well all the time. That's the best experience, right? But then the next best is like unexpected problems are really bad. You never want to have unexpected problems. You're much better off having an anticipated problem handled well than an unexpected problem that sort of leaves you stranded or whatever. So what we realize is that, and the more time passes, the more elapsed time passes, the more things can go wrong, right? I mean, it's just literally, there's more chance, more time for things to go wrong, the more time elapses. So collapsing your response times, really sort of cuts, it takes away the risk, essentially, of these bad experiences happening. But that kind of gets into this notion of an action, which is like, what takes away this risk of a bad thing happening, right? How do I create the conditions where those risks aren't present? Right? There's just kind of the inactive thinking model, at work there. I mean, it's interesting you brought up the issue of bottlenecks because constraints and bottlenecks are one form of constraint that are sort of essential to sort of how you manage a business. Most people though do think that the thing you do with a bottleneck is you get rid of it, right? That's kind of the default mindset I think most people have. What I would suggest is that bottlenecks, in many cases, you do want to get rid of a bottleneck because it's kind of limiting, what you want to get done. So getting rid of it can sometimes be helpful, but it's also something you can use to kind of regulate. Well, back up a second. I have a 3-step model for development. The first is innovation, right? To innovate, and to innovate, we either eliminate a constraint for a customer or we eliminate a constraint for ourselves, and it kind of creates a new system of how to operate. Right. The second step in beyond innovation is regulation, which is I want things to be predictable and regular and making this innovation work regularly, predictably, right? And that's where constraints are actually bottlenecks can be very beneficial because you can use one bottleneck in the system to control the entire system. If you use it as like the drum beat or the heartbeat of the system, and subordinate everything else to that. So everything else is just supporting that. So as long as you're focusing on making that one piece work well, it simplifies the whole system, regulates it, and makes it predictable. And this is the notion that a bottleneck can actually be quite strategic in terms of where you choose to have it in your system. And then the third step is really acceleration, which should only happen after you've regulated, because accelerating something that's out of control just leads to out of control experiences. And that's kind of these are the kind of places where people, I think, struggle, which is we don't know how to innovate, we don't know how to regulate, we don't know how to accelerate. And these are more of the technical side of an action, if you will.
Right.
And if it's helpful, I might be able to help to walk you through kind of what I do with a client in sort of like a high level and just kind of give you a sense of how it works. And the first step, like I say, is to understand your objectives. Everybody's got a different set of objectives, whether you're right. And most of the clients I work with are people who want to build a business. They're not, some of them want to go off and have a lifestyle, which is great. It's no judgment. It's just that's your different objective, right? And these things are not incompatible. But what I typically find is that, they're spending 95% of their calendar is dedicated to reactive, fixing of issues and problems and whatnot. So they're so deeply immersed in their just fighting the fires that they don't have time to think. And many of them actually have jobs, not businesses.
Right.
Really on the small side. And helping them first just take a step back and say, how do I? This is just simply this asking I draw a line on a piece of paper and say, down here is all the reactive behaviors. So you're tense, you're reacting, you're responding.
Yeah.
It's the world is driving you. Above the line is kind of you are driving the world. You are in the driver's seat again. You are somebody who is creating, building, making things happen. And it's not just it's more the building side of creation rather than necessarily the action side of creation.
Right.
So, and whether you're above that line or below the line. Everybody does. right? Most people are like, yeah, I'm in the reactive mode. I need to get up to this higher level mode, and helping yourself. And I find that just 3 times a day, if you can sort of schedule, right, a check-in with yourself. Am I above the line or below the line? Right? You realize I'm below the line. I need to get up there, and it resets your mind, right? To go say, I need to be objective focused. I need to think about what behaviors do I want? What conditions do I want? And it just brings you back up.
That's
just
good. I like that.
Just put a meeting in your own calendar 3 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
It says, I'm going to do this,
That's good.
The second thing is just track your time, right? See how much time you are spending on all kinds of reactive crap. And you'll see it's an enormous amount of time. Just color code your calendar, right? Was it reactive? And it'll be like red,
Yeah.
And so, and then there's got to be a step that says, how do I change this? How do I innovate? How do I get out of this thing to some other level, right? And most people will think about how do I improve something by 10% or 20%, or maybe even double it, or and the way you get there is you just work harder. That's what people do. They work harder, they try harder. It's kind of the, I'll grind it out, I'll get that extra 10, 20%, 30%, 100%, whatever. That just never takes you out. That you just can't innovate within that. You're not innovating, you're just working harder, right? And to innovate, you have to move up to some other level. You have to take the whole system of your life into a whole nother level. And the most common question I use is like, well, what would your business look like if it was 10x, doing 10x the business? Because at 10x, you can't be doing what you're doing now. It's a different business, right? And what invariably you see happen is, then the first question is sort of, what would you be doing differently, right? Because you can't, if you're the doer now, you're the guy delivering everything. At 10x, you can't be delivering.
No.
Your job now becomes one of development, one of like, figuring out how do I get other people to deliver this work, and that's like the first insights like starts to go, oh crap, my world needs to be different. If I want to be out of this kind of reactive mode, I need to get into a mode where I'm developing this business and having other people do the work. And then you just realize that, how do I get there? And this is kind of the truly tricky, interesting thing about innovation is your first question should be, what do I take away? What do I get rid of, right? There's a bunch of work you shouldn't be doing. There's a bunch of customers you shouldn't be serving. Fire them, right? I mean, they're like terrible employees. They're worse than terrible. A terrible customer is worse than a terrible employee.
Yeah.
It just consumes you and you feel like you have to serve them, but you don't, right? And you'll end up finding that it's probably like 20% of your customers are really important to you. And you should be doubling, tripling down your efforts against that small segment of customers that are really important. The ones where it's a perfect fit, where you can dominate your market, as you're describing. You are the service that fits with them, and increase your market share there, by 10x, right? And you'll be like your business will be way simpler. It'll be much more focused and much more profitable. But it really is this notion of, before you think about adding something into your life, think about what you're going to declutter. What are you going to take out of your life?
That's critical.
This innovation is the first step of innovation is to block something that is something that is familiar and experientially, just something you're taking for granted today. Blocking, and it's a blocking. It is a constraint in the sense of I am. I say I can no longer deliver. I'm going to block myself from delivering services to customers personally, right? I'm going to constrain myself and say I can't do that. Intentionally constrain myself. I can't do that. I have to figure that creates a necessity for me to invent something new, right? Necessity is the mother of invention. So you got to create this necessity that forces the innovation to come out, and that's kind of this first step of innovation. And once you kind of figured out what you're taking away, then you can start thinking about how do you focus. How do you use a constraint to focus your attention on the piece that's actually left over, that's really most important. But then you'll figure out some new way of working, new objective and way of what you want to achieve. You figure out what you want to have happen, but then you have to make that happen.
Right.
That's where the second step in the process, which is regulation, takes in, right? Which is, now you're in this notion of how do I turn this kind of ambition into a regular process, right? And how do I make it happen consistently, right? And a client in the oil industry, we wanted to sell equipment to the oil industry. They were selling it to everybody in anybody who would buy this equipment, they would sell it to it, originally, and so, but it changed it around. So if we want to be 10x, we need to be in what they call program accounts. We need to have $10 million accounts, not $100,000 accounts. So they said, we're only going to target 40 customers, right? We're going to spend all of our time selling to those 40 customers, right? And then so to regulate that sale, right? The key factor in that is just how much face time are we getting with the right people and those customers. We have a good product, but we need to make sure they know it, they believe it, and they understand it, and it's compelling to them. We need to understand how we connect our product to their constraint, right? They are constrained in terms of how fast they can get oil out of the ground. Can we help them get oil out of the ground faster? And so we set up a process where, we constrained the sales force and said, you can only call on these accounts.
Yeah.
Right. And we're going to measure you essentially by how much time you spend visiting those accounts.
Mm-hmm.
And how many introductions you make to those accounts to our internal experts. Right. So we kind of created a process where, and then we created the underlying reporting mechanism to say, every week they had to report. They had to say, who did they call? And we're only dealing with 40 customers now, right?
Right.
So you can actually talk about them individually, and it becomes like, as a salesperson, you don't want to have nothing to say. Don't want to be able to say, I didn't talk to anybody, right? So you sort of created this regular mechanism whereby they had to report that they were doing the behavior you wanted them to do. We created the condition where they were spontaneously doing what we wanted them to do because there was this kind of this accountability mechanism built into the process. And once we got it regulated, then we can say, now, how do we amplify it? How do we accelerate it, right? Because once this is the trick problem most companies make, is they go straight from innovation to acceleration, right? And they end up kind of this chaos.
No processes.
They go from like, I have a great thing that works. I pour gas on the marketing, and I'm getting all kinds of demand, and I don't know how to fulfill it, and it's just a mess.
Yeah.
Right. So there's this intermediate step between innovation and acceleration called regulation, which is building the processes, making them regular.
Right.
And then at some point, the acceleration it's only going to go so far. It doesn't matter what you're doing. At some point, you'll kind of saturate your market. And this is the problem. People don't recognize that they don't recognize they fall in the trap of success, right? And they're like riding this wave of success, and I'm great, and then you become a bit complacent. And if you did this interesting thing in YPO, Young Presidents Organization, where we tracked called lifelines, where you kind of track up and down, the ups and downs of your life. What is that curve? Time on one dimension, ups and downs on how good it was. And what you see, everybody's pattern is ups and downs.
Oh boy. Oh yeah.
Right? And what you realize when you've done that and you've listened to all their stories is that the downs don't happen at the down. The down was not created at the down point. The down was created, the conditions was created at the top of the cycle, right? You were at your peak, but you just took your eye off the ball, right? And you got complacent, and you weren't reaching for that next thing. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't until you got to a bit of a crisis that you turned yourself around and kind of went back up. And so what I find what helpful to companies is to say, you want to be early in the process of, as you're growing, as you're developing, you need to be looking for what's next before you reach the saturation point. And you need to be prepared to and this is the tricky part for people, which is the takeaway problem. We talked about innovation, which is to jump to that next cycle, you have to take a step back. You often have to take a step back to go 2 steps forward, right? And what you'll see is that, so temporarily, right, this oil company, equipment company, they fired a bunch of customers. That's revenue gone, right? They had to take a step back to allow them to it's like pruning your garden. You got to take away something, but that taking away means your garden is not going to look so good at that moment, right? You're creating a condition where it's going to look better in the future, and being able to manage that cycle is really the fundamental challenge of management. And it's one of the reasons why sort of public companies have such difficult time, right? Which is the markets don't ever accept you going backwards, right? I'm not going to take a dip in earnings to get future earnings. They just don't feel good about that. And so they get punished for that. And so they don't end up, so behaviorally, they won't do that. right? But
Yeah.
then they end up sort of in this is kind of the innovator's dilemma of, Christensen's, you get disrupted because you couldn't shift to the new curve, because you couldn't take that step backwards. But if you're a private company, or a company that's being well managed, you're constantly looking at, I'm on the acceleration curve. What's my next innovation? And and how do I manage that transition from this curve to the next curve?
We are winding down, and I want to go into one section really quick that's really important that I think the listeners, because a lot of the listeners have smaller, what you would consider smaller companies for sure. You're in the billions and the hundreds of millions, and I would say a lot of the listeners, well, even my client base is sort of the $10 to $50 million range, probably something like that. That smaller company, and I think one of the biggest challenges for that size of a company, and I see it every time I talk to a client, is that focus, that sort of, I hate the word narrowing, but it's, what's your vertical? Who's your ideal market?
Yeah.
And I have several clients right now that really they're having a very hard time, focusing to get down to that, where it's like, here's our ideal market. Here's where the revenue is really solid. The profits are good. Let's go right here. And why do you think, and we really truly have a couple minutes here, so I don't want to go too long on this, but why do you think, you've worked with bigger companies, but what's your thought on the mindset of a leader because it really, I do believe, and for me, my contact is with the leader, the CEO, the owner, the founder. That's who I work with. So when I'm talking to them, I'm like, no. You're so broad. You've got to, if you don't tighten it up, people are, even somebody's going to come in that say, maybe they consider buying the company. Yep. And they say, well, what do you guys do? And the founder says, well, we do. We're here. And then, so
well, I think we're programmed from birth to believe that more is better than less, always, right?
Yes.
And we somehow have learned this notion that diversifying our risk is the way to lower risk, right? And that's actually just a bad idea for the entrepreneur. That's a good idea for the investor, but it's a bad idea for an entrepreneur, right? The worst thing you can do as an entrepreneur is be diversified. Because you end up being sort of an inch deep and a mile wide, and you're just not making any progress, right? And I think the problem for the entrepreneur, I know this myself because I struggle with the same issue, in my practice.
Oh, right? So do I.
Which is, I can do all this stuff. Right? I have like this really broad capability set that I can apply anywhere, and I have very in-depth and complicated solutions I can bring to any kind of solution I want to. But that's not the most helpful thing to your customer, right? And this is something that I've learned a bit the hard way, which is think replication, not complication. So what I mean by that is great things come from simple things repeated over and over and over again. And then they kind of morph over time into this complicated thing. If you try and build something complicated from the start, it's almost always a failure, right? And the thing is, you have a complicated solution. It does all these 9 zillion things people want it to do, or you think they need to do, but they don't need any of that. They need like a tiny sliver.
That's right.
Right. And my encouragement to clients is that the best way to be successful is to take, if you have 100 customers, find which are the 10 that are the most important out of the 100. Which are the 10 that are the most important? And I think most important, I mean the one where your solution is the best thing.
I was going to say you serve them the best. Yep.
And I would even go further and say, what's the 10% of your solution that serves those 10% the best, right? That's where you ought to zero in, double down on both, customer narrowing and product narrowing, and like that's the thing you should be. And then you should be saying, how do I sell that 10% over and over and over again, and then let them mature into the other 100% of your product.
Yep.
Let them develop, and this is the development versus growth problem, right? Which is, we think growth, which is get more and more and more, as opposed to thinking development, which is more like a gardener's perspective, which is let me plant the seeds and let that grow, right? Let that develop over time. And I think if we can adopt them, instead of a hunter mindset, more of a gardener mindset, right? management teams would be much better off and much more focused. But it's really this notion which is a delusion that diversification lowers our risk, when in fact it actually, as an entrepreneur, it's the worst thing you can do for yourself. I mean, you basically have you're not playing to win, you're playing not to lose.
Well, even from a business development standpoint, you're not speaking that ideal client's language. Like, you're not really zoned in on their challenges, their issues, because you're so broad. Yep. And that's, again, where that narrowing can really, and if you can own that space, even on that smaller level, the $50 million business, everybody's happy. Yeah. It's a good business.
And if you can anchor that inside of that business, right, what'll happen is that you will grow with them. Right. Mm-hmm. They will trust you, and they will bring you more work, and you will bring them more value, and you will develop together in sort of co-development, instead of like trying to, make them believe they need this thing that they don't know, so they know they believe, and maybe they should believe they need your thing. And probably 90% of people who should believe don't, because they're just not ready for it. They're just not emotionally developed enough to be able to absorb it. Right. And this is kind of my struggle is like, I have all these things I can communicate to people, but I can't, they're like, I'm drinking from a fire hose. I don't need all that, right? What I need to know is like, what do I do tomorrow? How do I make my life better immediately? Which is why I go to this notion of, just schedule a meeting with yourself 3 times a day.
I love that. That's a great tip right there.
Ask yourself, are you above the line? Are you being builder, enactor, creator, or are you being reactor? Is the world happening?
I love that. That's the tip of this whole thing right there.
And then ask yourself 3 questions, right? What are my objectives? What am I trying to do, right? What behaviors will make those objectives happen? And what conditions do I need to create to sort of spontaneously get those conditions, those behaviors to emerge? And you can ask it about yourself. You could ask it about other people around you, and you'll find that, right? Because I'm creating, what I'm doing here is I'm creating a condition,
yep,
right, which produces a behavior, right, which leads to an objective, right, which is, I want to create a condition where you are forcing yourself to ask these questions, make yourself more self-aware, become more intentional, right? And by doing that, you will realize your objectives more often, right? So as I'm saying, this is kind of, it's designing the conditions that produce the objectives, right? Not necessarily the actions flow from the conditions. But that's where I start with people, and then you can give them. And then I truly try and counsel, do something simple that's repetitive over and over again. Maybe you may feel boring in some ways, but do it repetitively. Something simple, it's really, really, really useful, and do it a lot. Become like a very, people, if you want to make traction, right, start very narrow, provide a very narrow solution that produces a huge amount of value to people. And then grow from, and repeat that enough until you kind of become the master, dominated your market there. Right? You've created a really strong whole, and then you can start adding another core, another whole to your business from that as a base. And this principle of, I'm getting off into perhaps more esoteric things, but there is this notion that really strong systems are made up of strong wholes that are interconnected and interdependent with each other. And so the way you grow a beautiful, building complex, for example, is you create centers that are really strong wholes that independently have power in of themselves, and you start coupling them with other ones. And you do this one, and you do it more as an unfolding process, right? You're creating these wholes in an unfolding process rather than so they kind of, you get one done, you start to add the next, you add the next, you add the next. It's not trying to do all of them at once.
Right.
You don't want to have your business unfold over time. And the best way to do that is to use this 10% solution idea and solve a very narrow problem repetitively. And then people will come to you for more and more help.
Exactly. Well, you're building trust, and you're building, this was very good. It was very, very sort of, this was a different kind of podcast. But I think your knowledge, I don't think I've ever talked this least amount in my lifetime, ever. Especially on my own podcast. So I think I think you brought a lot of great information. So if anybody wants to get in contact with you, Do you have a website? Do you want them to go to LinkedIn? Let our listeners know how they can contact you.
Probably the easiest way is just to go to LinkedIn. You can message me for free. I have my messenger set up so anybody can send me a message if they want to.
Okay.
I have a website. It's LinkedIn, whatever the thing is. My username is Alex Nesbitt, all one word.
Spell your last name for everybody.
It's Alex, ALEX, Nesbitt, NES, like Sam, B like boy, ITT.
Yeah, perfect.
Or you can go to alexnesbitt.com. That's my website blog. I kind of post more longer form content. I'm working on how best to sort of package up these ideas into more sort of formal training kinds of things, more independent training types of things.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully over time I'll be able to make more of that accessible. But in the meantime, I'm happy to chat with people. I love talking about people's businesses.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And I think my guess is I feel I may be a bit, people may not feel approachable enough, right? Which is, given my background of working with big companies, but I've had people, a guy messaged me from Egypt. He's a IT service management guy, and he's trying to figure out what he could do himself differently. I gave him like 5 different ideas for ways he could create.
There you go. So you talked to an individual on that one. There you go. Not a $50 billion company.
He's an employee who's feeling like he can't make progress inside of an employee. And so I said, well, what you do is you provide, you're basically doing help desk. So, for big company, right?
Yeah.
But you can go out, you given that skill, you could do that same thing for small companies, right? You can be an outsourced help desk for small companies. And even further, you can actually, there's help desk software you could private label, and you could, offer those up to people. But you're basically enacting a new thing in the world, right? That's valuable to other people. And as long as you can kind of keep that in mind, that you can be the developer, you can be the builder, and there's all these pieces and parts sitting out there in the world that are just ready and waiting for you to take them and use them. That's the exciting thing about life, is we get to create our worlds.
Exactly, 100%. Well, Alex, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, Mike. Thank you for having me.
You've just listened to the Dominate Your Market podcast with CEO, business consultant, and author Michael Peterson. Growth-minded CEOs hire Michael to explode their revenues, build an amazing company, and create a transformational mindset that encapsulates growth, success, and ultimately happiness. His book, Dominate Your Market, is creating quite a stir in the marketplace. Go to dominateyourmarketbook.com and get your first chapter free.